All right, so now we're just going to continue on where we left off in our conversation on the meaning of Christmas. And having characterized internalization, I now would like to pose the question, what is the relationship between internal speech and Scrooge's moral development? So internal speech or inner speech is crucial to Scrooge's moral development. The development of conscientious traits, that is one of the hallmarks of Scrooge's moral development, as is the case with moral development more generally, partly arises from the internalization of moral speech. The inner moral speech can be thought of as analogous to the voice of conscience, Scrooge's conscience. The internalization of moral speech is fostered through a specific area or zone of learning. This is known as the zone of proximal development, another concept formulated by Vygotsky in his work Mind and Society, published the date I have for this particular text is 1978, but I believe it was much earlier. And so the inevitable question is thus, what is the zone of proximal development, and how does it foster Scrooge's moral development? The zone of proximal development is an area of learning where an individual moves from their actual level of development to their potential level of development under the guidance of or in collaboration with a more competent peer. The activities of more competent moral individuals, for instance, that Scrooge encounters in his experiential journey, especially with the three spirits, fosters Scrooge's moral development by helping him move through the zone of proximal development, from his actual level of moral functioning and activity to his potential level of moral functioning and activity. It's his internalization of the moral speech of various characters that he encounters in the story that lends itself to the cultivation of his own moral character. For example, his internalization of the moral speech of, say, Fred or Marley or Cratchit, and perhaps even some of the spirits. So technically, what is the zone of proximal development? To be more precise, Vygotsky describes the zone of proximal development as follows, and this is a quote from his Mind and Society. It is the distance between the actual developmental level as determined by independent problem solving and the level of potential development as determined through problem solving under adult guidance or in collaboration with more capable peers. What this suggests is that the zone of proximal development is Scrooge's potential level of moral development, not his actual level of moral development. The latter manifests as the development into his conscientious self. The former manifests as his unconscientious self. The zone of proximal development, in other words, is prospective development. Actual development is retrospective development. So the process of becoming a moral, conscientious self is like the process of a flower budding or flowering. It's not a product of development like the fruiting of a flower. And here I'm thinking of Aristotle's distinction between potentiality and actuality that might be applicable here. So Scrooge's zone of proximal development defines his own moral functioning that has not yet matured, but is in the process of maturation. His moral thoughts, feelings, and actions, for instance, that will soon mature, but which are currently in an embryonic state, may be considered moral functions within the bounds of the zone of proximal development. Scrooge's moral development, moreover, is a dialogical process. So, as mentioned, Scrooge's moral learning throughout his formative experiential processes in the Christmas Carol are rudimentary to him becoming a more authentic moral being, a more conscientious being. His moral learning, as just discussed, takes place within the zone of proximal development. Within this zone, moreover, the moral learning that takes place may be characterized as a fusion and expansion of what we might call, in the hermeneutical language of Gadamer and friends, a fusion and expansion of moral horizons. And a horizon is a range of vision that can be seen from a particular standpoint in space. Perhaps Scrooge's vision, that is his discernment of moral perception, his intelligent moral foresight, and his moral imagination, has been fused with the vision of more morally competent individuals that he encounters. For example, Marley, Cratchit, Fred, or the ghosts. His vision, moreover, has been expanded as a result of these encounters. The nature of this learning, moreover, is dialogical in character, insofar as inner speech is fundamentally a dialogical process. So what is a dialogical process? A dialogical process is that there is always a dialogue between at least two voices within the human mind, a dialogue that mediates and shapes human mental functioning in significant ways. Therefore, dialogue mediates and shapes moral functioning in this manner. And aside from being a dialogical process, inner speech is also dialectical in nature. That is, it is a dynamic and continuous process in which there is a reciprocal interaction between inner speech or thinking and external speech. The principle applies to the interaction between moral thinking, example, internal speech, and moral speech. That would be external speech. So I'd like to consider how these ideas might apply to the dialogical processes of moral functioning and Scrooge's moral functioning in particular. And the dialogical process can be applied to moral functioning and activity in situations in which a child, an adolescent, or an adult is confronted with a moral problem, conflict, or dilemma. So in such situations, an individual responds to these challenges by means of inner speech or dialogue, that is, by talking through a solution to oneself. So to consider some examples from the Christmas Carol, when Scrooge is faced with the moral problem, conflicts, and dilemmas at various stages of the Christmas Carol, one could argue, according to this theory, that he does so by talking through a solution to himself, sometimes more implicitly, sometimes more explicitly. And one such conflict could be between Scrooge's many selves and personalities. For example, his conscientious self and his unconscientious self, his disagreeable self and his agreeable self, his introverted self and his extroverted self. His problem might be one of deciding which voice to listen to and act upon. For example, the conscientious voice may be imploring him to be authentically dutiful to himself and to others, and the unconscientious voice might be imploring him to be self-serving at the expense of the suffering of others. So this is the application of Vygotsky's theory and similar thinkers' theory to moral functioning. So at this stage, I just want to briefly take a pause to reflect on what we've just gone over and whether we think this is a good theoretical framework for understanding Scrooge's moral development and maybe moral development more generally. Do you have any specific thoughts on this, Ryan?
I mean, I almost have nothing to say because I think it does describe it. Like, I couldn't have described it better myself. I think you've used the concepts from like Gadamer and Tappan and Vygotsky really well. And I think it just maps on, it's a perfect framework to use, I think. Like, in terms of the dialectic, I like to think of it sort of as like a conversation between myself and what it is that I want, and sort of the voice of the other, which represents our duty, our dutifulness. And what is it? What we have a duty to is to respect the grounds that make what it is that I want and getting what I want possible. Right. So we need to. It's a conversation between what it is that I want and our duty. And I think a moral person needs to get what they want, but respect the grounds or the conditions that make that possible in the first place. So, lying, cheating, stealing to get what you want, you're undermining the system that makes it possible to get that makes these things possible. right? And that's what makes it immoral, is that it's violating sort of, or undermining the grounds that anything is possible, that we can make anything from.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it would seem that moral transgressions of moral duty, um, are destructive to oneself and destructive to others, um, as I think it undermines the very, institutions and, forms of life that allow us to function harmoniously with each other.
Yeah, I think what I've written is like, our duty is to the grounds that make what I want and getting what I want possible, which is what we talked about before, the common good, or the good.
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember what theory that was, but it was sort of that
Yeah.
communalistic dutifulness.
Yes, communalistic dutifulness. Yeah, yeah. Being obligated to the common good, the good of the community, but also the good of oneself as well. And the two aren't mutually exclusive.
Yeah, I mean, the only way that we get what we want as individuals is out of respect of the common good, or the good, or whatever you want to call it, which is just that affective, volitional sort of basis, that attitude towards one another, that respect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the moral feelings, the somatic markers, um, um, the visceral experiences that we have.
Which, as you point out, comes out of that dialogical process, right? Those feelings, that sort of that tension, like that's what gives rise to the feelings.
Yeah, yes, of course. It's interesting to note the relationship between the two, between our feelings and our thoughts, and I think there's a reciprocal interplay there. But the sense that I get from reading Vygotsky and similar thinkers is that without the feelings, then thought is not effective.
Well, it
It's,
has no meaning. Essentially, it loses its meaning altogether if there's no feeling or emotion that
right.
expresses it.
Yes, indeed. Indeed. Well, I think we've hit upon some interesting um, ideas here, and we can return to them. But for the sake of making progress with our analysis of the carol, I'd like to move on to the next topic here. So, at the outset of introducing the topic of Scrooge's moral development and the factors underlying it, I cited some of the most salient experiences that shaped his development. I would here like to consider four: Scrooge's encounter with Marley, his encounter with the ghosts of Christmas past, his encounter with the ghost of Christmas present, and his encounter with the ghost of Christmas yet to come. So, with regards to Scrooge's encounter with Marley, to begin with, that experience evokes terror within Scrooge, and it affords him the opportunity to internalize Marley's voice, a voice that admonishes him to avoid persisting in the avaricious lifestyle that Marley led and that Scrooge continues to lead. Or if he does, he will be condemned to the same purgatorial fate as Marley, that is, to walk the earth as an insubstantial shade for all eternity, incapable of rendering serviceable moral actions onto others. And just as a side note here, the terror that Marley evokes, it's I think in my reading, it's partly the terror of being haunted by Marley's ghost, but it's also partly the terror of suffering the same dire fate as Marley. Perhaps it's Scrooge's fear of suffering the same fate as Marley that serves as an effective volitional basis for changing from an unconscientious to a conscientious being. The moral voice Scrooge internalizes from Marley is a conscientious one, I think, that admonishes him to treat others with, in Marley's words, charity, mercy, forbearance, and benevolence. This moral voice could aid Scrooge in his own internal dialogical and dialectical process of moral reasoning throughout the rest of the story, and help him in ignoring the unconscientious, disagreeable, and avaricious voice. For example, the one that tells him to make and hoard money at the expense of others. And listening to and acting upon the conscientious, agreeable, and extroverted voice. For example, the voice which tells him to share his wealth to the benefit of others. Scrooge's experiences with the ghost of Christmas past and present also foster ethical feelings. Scrooge's imaginal experiences, or they could be actual experiences, I leave that as a matter of up to a matter of debate, that are brought forth by the agency of the ghosts of Christmas, especially the ghosts of Christmas past and present, evoke within Scrooge feelings of love, which lends itself to the internalization and cultivation of the spirit of Christmas, that is, the spirit of benevolence. For instance, his imaginal revisiting of his past experience, guided by the ghost of Christmas past, evokes powerful ethical feelings within Scrooge. These include feelings of remorse. For example, when Scrooge oversees his former self alone and abandoned at the melancholy schoolhouse, he remembers the young caroler whom he ignored outside his office. And this remembrance evokes feelings of remorse and of compassion, feelings which are part and parcel of love. So what's going on here? Well, in my opinion, Scrooge might be engaged in an internal dialectical process with himself, one in which he's engaged in a moral conversation with himself, which is assisting him in the process of moral reasoning. This conversation with his conscientious internal voice might arouse feelings of remorse, compassion, and love, and which may be admonishing him that he ought to treat others with compassion and love. In this scene and in subsequent scenes, we might surmise that Scrooge is engaged in his internal dialectical process with himself, although it could be implicit and less explicit. For example, when Scrooge beholds the vision of Fezziwig's party and re-experiences it, he comes to the realization that each individual has the power to make others happy through good deeds, a power that cannot be achieved by mere money alone, and this evokes feelings of remorse for Cratchit, and thus his compassion and love continues to expand. So just to offer a few side notes here, the dialogical and dialectical processes that we've been talking about inspire new ethical realizations, new awarenesses, such as the awareness of the plight of others and the awareness of what one can do within the scope and limits of one's own free will to ameliorate their plight and better their lives. So this is what Scrooge is coming to realize. And these feelings of remorse and compassion, moreover, and love that I mentioned, he experiences towards Cratchit and his family. And these feelings that he's experiencing, again, I think, represent the effective volitional basis that inspires his ethical and conscientious actions towards others. And what I think might be going on here is Scrooge might be internalizing the emotions of others, and so the emotions of compassion that he's witnessing being embodied by members of the Cratchit family. He may also be internalizing the moral voices of the Cratchit family themselves, and these moral voices are evoking those feelings of compassion. And again, this points to the interaction between moral voice and moral emotion. So, to take another example, when Scrooge beholds a vision of Bob Cratchit's son, Tiny Tim, and the rest of the Cratchit family as they're gathered around the hearth with chestnuts roasting on an open fire, which is the postcard family Christmas scene, Scrooge is struck by an emotion that seems to be uncharacteristic of him. He feels compassion for the family and concerns for the boy's chances for survival. Upon exposure to these scenes of the Cratchit family, Scrooge's perception is transformed. He no longer perceives Cratchit as a mere clerk, a functionary in his office, but as a person inherently worthy of respect and concern. And Scrooge, moreover, overhears Tiny Tim talking to his family about his affliction without any self-pity and with a matter-of-fact willingness to accept his affliction, accept that his affliction may serve a higher purpose. Perhaps Tiny Tim's selfless spirit grabs Scrooge's attention. While he perceives Tiny Tim's motivations as selfless, he might simultaneously come to the realization that his own motivations have been inherently selfish. Perhaps in this scene, too, Scrooge's understanding of what is meaningful shifts. He may come to see that a person can possess wealth other than a monetary kind. And just to offer a little more elaboration here, I think that Scrooge may have internalized also a bit of Tiny Tim's ethical nature, and in particular, Tiny Tim's selfless and conscientious voice. So to continue, Tiny Tim and the Cratchit family are, getting back to this question of wealth, are wealthy in the Christmas spirit and in love, a notion that Scrooge has previously thought as inconceivable. And these feelings, I think, sensitize Scrooge to the plight of others and his own plight. Scrooge inquires about the fate of Tiny Tim with the ghost of Christmas present. The ghost notes that Tiny Tim's dire fate may yet be avoided, provided there's a timely intervention. The ghost also makes the ironic remark, throwing back at Scrooge his own phrase that he previously uttered about the sick and destitute. If he be like to die, he had better do it and decrease the surplus population. Scrooge, now somewhat transformed, hears these words differently, now that he has seen the people to whom they apply, perhaps now realizing them to be heartless and incongruent with his newfound compassion. And I think this particular example gets to the interaction between outer dialogical processes and inner dialectical dialogical processes. Scrooge first engages in a dialogical conversation with the ghost of Christmas present. And this is an outer dialogue. And then the ghost uses irony and makes Scrooge realize that perhaps makes Scrooge realize, and then that Scrooge has acted unconscientiously, and Scrooge might begin internally reflecting on that, and that internal reflection in turn is this internal dialectical process with himself, and so the ghost is helping to evoke that inner process, and by virtue of Scrooge maybe internalizing the ghost's moral voice, and he's coming to realize that his former self has acted unconscientiously, heartlessly, and harmfully to others. And he's also coming to realize that he ought to act more conscientiously to others, to act more heartfully and helpfully to others. So that covers the Scrooge's experiences with the ghost of Christmas past and present, as well as his experiences with Marley. And so far, I think that the Vygotsky's developmental theory helps to shed light on Scrooge's own process of transformation here. And I think these examples help to argue in favor of that. What do you think of this analysis, Ryan, as far as applying the theory to the examples and trying to make sense of Scrooge's moral development?
I'm of the same attitude as before. I think it's a great representation of what Scrooge has undergone throughout the novella. And I just want to tie this back to what we were talking about before, with dutifulness and things like that. It seems like with the Ghost of Christmas Past, through trying to remind him about like benevolence, charity and mercy, is that like these are the foundations upon which like the things that he loves, like that's what makes it possible, right?
Mhm.
It's trying to remind him of what he needs in order
Mhm.
for the things that he wants to exist, for money, for all this. And when he says the surplus population must die or like kill them off, it's really showing him that he's forgetting about that diamond sort of
Mhm.
analogy, where he's forgetting about benevolence, charity, and mercy, the things that the things that he likes, what he wants, the sides of the diamond, the facets,
Mhm.
for the sake of the facets. He's like literally cutting the diamond, by wanting to kill a surplus population.
Mhm.
And if he keeps having this attitude, there's going to be no more diamond left.
Mhm.
Right? And as I'll kind of point out later, remind people, like in the next section where we get to his death, and at his grave, what that's sort of reminding him, jumping the gun a bit, is that if you forget about benevolence, charity, and mercy for the sake of the facets, for what he wants, jobs and everything, money,
Mhm.
uh, there's going to be no benevolence, charity, or mercy in his death. There'll be nothing left. There will be no diamond left at the end.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, and that's precisely, I think, what Marley's warning is all about. That Scrooge, um, he's in this position of power and privilege, and he can do great good with being in that position of power and privilege, right? Like as we were saying previously, with great power comes great responsibility, and um, I think Scrooge has the power, but he's shirked the responsibility, and what awaits him as a result, I think, is um, kind of like this purgatorial damnation, to wander as a insubstantial shade for all of eternity, now incapable of rendering, ethical and useful actions onto other people. And Marley's kind of trying to jolt Scrooge into awareness of that and saying, you're going to be condemned to, this afterlife of imprisonment forged by, your own chains, your own self created, bondage that's going to um, enslave you in the undiscovered country that awaits us. And so, yeah, no, I think that Scrooge is fundamentally undermining, um, his own self-interests and the his own good, and also the common good, to his own detriment.
In a way, it's like a country who like loses their right to govern. Like he has the right to govern insofar as he fulfills his duty to the people. And he's neglecting his duties, neglecting benevolence, charity, mercy, and therefore has lost his right to be in the position that he's in as a wealthy, industrious man.
Mhm.
It's the same sort of reasoning at play. It's you do not respect your duty to people, and therefore you do not have the right or deserve to occupy this position, because
Mhm.
you neglect the very grounds upon which you being in this position is possible.
Mhm.
The same with the government, right? You neglect the fact that you only rule because of us. You've
Mhm.
neglected that duty. for the sake of money or whatever. So
No,
yeah.
I think that's a fitting analogy, and I think it gets to the the core significance of Scrooge's moral transgression and its morally undesirable consequences and characteristics. So to move on with our analysis, let's return now to some of the salient examples within the Christmas Carol, now looking at Scrooge's experiences with the ghost of Christmas yet to come. And in the final stage, Scrooge is guided by the ghost of Christmas yet to come and has experiences of a horrible possible future. In this future, Scrooge encounters individuals whom he has known and witnesses how they all respond without much care or positive concern after he has died in the possible future. To begin, he first encounters a group of businessmen congregating on a city street. Each discusses the death of an unnamed man, but to the discerning reader, it is apparent that it is Scrooge. Their comments indicate little concern over his death. For instance, one says that they have only the slightest inclination to attend the funeral, and even then, it is not because they care for Scrooge in the slightest, but because they are enticed by getting a free lunch out of it. Scrooge is then led to two other men, both of whom he has forged a professional business relationship with. Each of these men, similarly, show no positive regard for Scrooge having learned of his death. Throughout all of these experiences, Scrooge himself does not know the identity of the unnamed man is his own, but he does know that these experiences are being arranged for his own moral betterment. Scrooge is also transported to a scene of a morgue where 4 people are in attendance and are presiding over a dead body covered behind a curtain. These people express no reverence with regards to the dead person shrouded behind the curtain. Rather, they laugh at the deceased person in a disrespectful and vengeful manner. They are not mourning the loss of this person, but are instead plundering the body. This scene evokes within Scrooge a feeling of terror, and from it he is able to discern a moral lesson, that a similar fate may belie him if he does not reform himself. And just as a side note here, again, this feeling of terror he's experiencing of this possible future, again, could serve as the effective volitional basis for Scrooge's personality transformation. And specifically, Scrooge's internalized internal dialectical-dialogical conversation within him in this particular scene might evoke the terror that he'll not be remembered fondly by others after he's died. And it's this terror that may very well motivate Scrooge to avoid that dire fate in his actual life by reforming himself into a more conscientious being. Scrooge draws the conclusion that no one in this scene cares anything for the dead man. He wishes to be shown someone who does feel some positive emotion associated with him. So Scrooge is led by the ghost to a scene in which he is observing an older couple contemplating how they will be financially far better off now that the death of an unnamed man, again implied to be Scrooge, whom they were indebted to, has occurred. And the only positive emotion is not a feeling of grief or fondness over the dead man, but a feeling of relief and gladness over his death, given that a more understanding moneylender will take over their debt. Scrooge wishes to see someone who might have felt some tenderness and who might have had some good things to say about the deceased person. Such a desire might be suggestive of an underlying unconscious need that Scrooge might harbor, a need for self-respect and self-love. So here we see that Scrooge's internalized dialectical conversation with himself is now evoking a more ethical and conscientious attitude towards himself. That is, that he ought to treat himself with self-respect and self-love as he's deserving of these things. It also gets to the effective volitional basis of his personality transformation. So this conversation with himself, I think, moreover, is evoking feelings of compassion that inspire his self-duty to treat himself with self-respect and self-love. Now, to continue, the lack of concern and even gleeful gladness expressed by those who knew Scrooge stands in stark contrast to the emotions that are evoked when Scrooge revisits the Cratchit family in the possible future. In this scene, Scrooge is overhearing the Cratchits' conversations and learns that Tiny Tim is on the verge of death, and he sees each family member mourning over his tragic fate. He sees each suffering from their own grief, but he also sees that each family member is emotionally supporting each other through the grieving process. And here I think that Scrooge is internalizing the compassion of the Cratchit family, and he's witnessing what he's witnessing in the scene will perhaps what he's witnessing and what he's internalizing in the scene, I think might extend to others and to himself. Finally, upon visiting the site of the morgue of which Scrooge's dead body is housed, the reader may be reminded of Fred's message that the universal fate of death makes all people fellow passengers to the grave. Yet this message is not necessarily bleak, but optimistic, where a person's deeds in life are the pathway to immortality after death and represent the triumph of the divine or the human spirit over death. Dickens expresses this attitude towards death thusly: "O dreadful death, set up thine altar here, and dress it with such terrors as thou hast at thy command. For this is thy dominion. But of the loved, revered, honored head, thou canst not turn one hair to thy dread purposes. It is not that the hand is heavy, it is not that the heart and pulse are still, but that the hand was open, generous, and true, the heart brave, warm, and tender. Strike, shadow, strike, and see his good deeds springing from the wound, to sow the world with life immortal." Heeding the wisdom of this message, Scrooge is now left with a confrontation with his own possible tragic fate as it has been revealed by the ghost. This confrontation brings forth the realization that it was his death that was not mourned, that it was his body that the ill-wishers plundered, that it was his death that brought forth rejoicing, not sorrow and gratitude. And just as a side note here, it's not so much an external dialectical process that brings forth Scrooge's realization that nobody will remember him fondly or respect him after he has died, but perhaps the internal dialectical process that these horrific images of his future conjure within him, and the attending aversive feelings, for example, such as those of terror, fear, and anxiety, that inspire him to become a more ethical and more conscientious being. Such internalized cognitions evoke the aversive feelings, which serve as the effective volitional basis for his transformation into a more ethical, and in this case, more conscientious being. Interestingly, at the end of the stave, and in contrast to the prior scenes in the story, Scrooge does not seek to resist the ghost by freeing himself from the ghost's presence. Rather, he is intent on conveying what he has learned from his visitations from the ghosts, and in affirming what he will now do based upon these learnings. He pledges, "I will honor Christmas in my heart and try to keep it all the year. I will live in the past, the present, and the future. The spirits of all three shall strive within me." So sums up this final example and Scrooge's encounters with a horrible possible future and the impact that these experiences have on his internalized thinking and upon his emotional, moral feelings and upon his moral functioning. And Ryan, do you think of the examples discussed? Does this think this accurate reflects the processes and the things that are bringing forth this change in Scrooge?
I mean, I think it's an accurate description, based on what is in the novella. And I think even from a personal experience myself, like, when you're confronted with that death, death in a way becomes a friend, because death reminds you to treat your life well, to love your life, because someday he's going to come to pick you up, and you got to treat the life of others well. And just the idea of his body being plundered, people thinking and realizing that they're better off with him dead. No mourning, no sorrow, no gratitude towards him or his life. It really goes to show that his neglect of benevolence and charity and mercy, they're in his life to others, that's what he got in death. That's what death will bring you. So always remember that death is your friend. Listen to death.
I think that's a good insight you put forward there. I feel like a living consciously and mindfully with the awareness that you're a mortal finite being in a mortal finite body, in a this ephemeral existence. I think just speaking.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, speaking personally, I think that is highly motivational as far as motivating someone to change on a sort of fundamental ontological level, like Scrooge does, and having that vivid image of that reality, that possible horrible future, presented to him vividly through the agency of the ghost. Like the ghost kind of shows him this movie screen of this horror picture of his life that it's going to turn into if he doesn't change. I think that perceptual experience, is so much more visceral than just abstractly contemplating it, and I feel like that this gets back maybe to the power of, imagery to conjure these feelings of terror, and then these feelings of terror in turn, awakening this desire to change, and not just the feelings, but also the conversation, the conversation he's having with himself that these images bring up, brings up these thoughts that he won't be remembered fondly and with gratitude. And, he maybe he thinks this to himself, and then, this is part of why he, experiences such terror, over that fact, maybe.
If I were to sort of describe, the change in phenomenology of Scrooge's experience, when you were young, and you're alone, maybe in your room playing by yourself as a kid, it's like your whole experience is centered around you, right? Like you're the only thing that exists. It feels like somehow like you're the center of what's going on. But at some point you might get that this is what Sartre calls the look. You realize someone's watching you, and it's almost as if the center of your experience now, say they're behind you, goes from being you to somewhere behind you. Center of experience, and because someone's behind you. It's a really weird shift. It's like everything is around you, and all of a sudden the horizon, so to speak,
Mhm.
gets how the middle of the horizon gets shifted behind you.
Mhm.
Because there's another person present. And for Scrooge, truly becoming conscientious is in some sense like living out the belief, the experience and belief in God, because
Mhm.
it's as if there is constantly around you. You are not the center of the experience. It's like things aren't happening to you anymore.
Mhm.
It it's like as if there's that constant look, the look of the other, the grand other
Mhm.
that is constantly present. And that's what it means to be truly conscientious and to believe in God, is to
Mhm.
constantly have this proverbial look of the grand other, that to have
Mhm.
that conversation, to be aware of that conversation and that voice,
Mhm.
especially of the other.
Mhm.
And it really does change your experience. Like for me, I consider myself an atheist, but I use Christian language because it is what people are familiar with, right? But
Mhm.
really, what it is it's in my mind. I can use God as a placeholder word for that look of the other,
Mhm.
and that's always with me,
Mhm.
right? And that's what I think is always with Scrooge now later in the novella, and it really is a shift in perspective on your entire experience. It feels as if you're there's almost no center to the experience at all.
Mhm.
It's really weird. It's like you're everything all at once.
Mhm.
It's really strange. And that's what I've personally been experiencing since I've had that relationship with God, or the look of the other.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, I thought that might be interesting. I don't know if you can get a grasp on what I mean by the look of the other, and like what that feels like when you're alone and then all of a sudden somebody becomes present.
Mhm.
But that's sort of how I feel in terms of Scrooge. He just has that, but on a sort of abstract scale, the general look of the other, that
Mhm.
general attitude towards benevolence, towards the
Mhm.
grand.
Mhm. Yeah, no, I think you're saying a lot of interesting and deep things there, and trying to make sense of that. I think that Scrooge is going again. I think he's to use my own terminology. I think he's shifting from an egocentric perspective to a less egocentric perspective, um, and I think that his perspective is becoming widened to include uh, the other, to include other people, and um, and to consider with um, you know compassion their plight, and to want to strive to better their situation. And so I think that's a matter of becoming conscious of their suffering, and that consciousness of their suffering, I think, then in part helps to give birth to that conscientiousness, which enables him to relieve their suffering. And all of that, I think, because he is he's open to expanding his horizon. He's open to um, widening his sphere of moral concern. Um, beginning, perhaps incrementally with you know one person, and then a few people, and then more and more people, and it's, I think, his witnessing of their suffering. It's his internalization of their perspective. It's his internalization of their emotions and their behavioral repertoires that allows him to become that moral self that he truly is. And I think This maybe might be getting back to what you were saying about becoming mindful of the look of the other.
Yeah, well, I mean, you said it so well with the openness. Like being open, on that in this sense would mean like being open to the look of the other, like your susceptibility to the openness and the horizon expansion of the other, right? So if you're someone who's very, not open, the effects of the look of the other are not going to be as profound on you.
Mm-hmm. And then there again, we were getting back to the interaction between the different traits, here, openness and conscientiousness. I think openness in some sense is a precursor for maybe all significant change. And I think you have to be open to change before you can change, You can't be closed off. You need to be fully open. You need to be listening.
Maybe that's why
Not
it
only
comes first on the scale. Maybe there's a reason why it's in that order. Conscientiousness seems pretty high up there too.
yeah.
I think neuroticism more maybe like more of like an emergent thing from the other ones, extroversion and openness and agreeableness. So yeah, it's
Mm-hmm.
it's really interesting. I want to maybe do some research into whether or not there's a logic to the way that it's ordered, or if it's just because it spells ocean.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm not sure whether it's just phrased that way because it's a useful acronym or whether there's some logical ordering behind it. It's a possibility. I mean, it's a possibility too, regardless of the way that the acronym is phrased. There could be, in considering the different traits, there could be maybe some that are more, say, fundamental to moral development and than others are, you know. So that might be interesting to look into at some later point. But I think that again, being open to yourself and listening to, those physiological, visceral, emotional processes that are going on within the deepest recesses of you, as well as listening um, to others in a fully and in an open-hearted and open-handed manner. I think those are fundamental to that process of moral development that we've been talking about. So maybe just to bring this full circle and to wrap things up, in summary, we've examined the transformation of Scrooge's ethical orientation to the world and the changes in his personality that accompany that transformation. That this transformation in Scrooge, as we discussed, was characterized as a dying away of unconscientious traits and as a birthing of conscientious traits within him. The becoming of the conscientious self that he truly is, as we discussed, was marked by an increased sense of communalistic dutifulness and by increased moral feelings towards others. When we examined the relationships between experiential factors, for example, Scrooge's non-ordinary experiences, and social cognitive factors, such as Scrooge's internalization of dialogical and dialectical processes, and affective factors, such as Scrooge's moral feelings, and how these factors interact to catalyze Scrooge's personality transformation. In bringing our conversation full circle, by returning to the question that motivated our conversation, the question of the meaning of Christmas, I would like to offer my own personal response to this question, which has been enriched and informed by the conversation that we have had. For me, the meaning of Christmas is to catalyze a process of moral change, a change from a less moral being to a more moral being, by being open and receptive to the experiences, thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that give birth to that being. This indeed was keeping with Dickens' own artistic intent of the novella, as literary critics have noted. As critic Paul Davis puts it, He, that is Dickens, wanted his Christmas story to transform the life of its reader in the way the spirits transformed Scrooge's life. Whereas critic Joseph Gold notes, the significance of Christmas lies in its answer to the question of what moral conversion looks like in someone who goes from being immoral to moral. The answer, he writes, is to be converted from closedness to openness, from frigidity to warmth, from isolation to brotherhood, from death to life. And this is the meaning of Scrooge and Marley, and this is the meaning of Christmas. It is in this open-hearted commitment to changing ourselves into the benevolent beings that we truly are that the meaning of Christmas is to be found. So that's my current take on the meaning of Christmas after this latest reading of A Christmas Carol. And so I'm just going to leave the floor with you, Ryan, to close and to offer your own reflections on the meaning of Christmas after all the conversations we've had leading up to this point.
Yeah, I just want to end sort of with a quote from my favorite philosopher, Friedrich Nietzsche, of course. We had it earlier in the series, but I just wanted to revisit for everybody and for myself. So I'll just read it off here. It says, I love New Year's Eve and birthday parties, for they allow us hours, which admittedly we can often create for ourselves, but seldom do, in which the soul can stand still and review a phase of its own development. Crucial resolutions are born in such moments. For a few moments, one is raised above time and almost steps outside of one's own development. One secures and documents the past and receives the courage and resoluteness to resume traveling along one's path. So I just wanted to end with that because I think that is a great kind of summary, and it sort of encapsulates the meaning of Christmas for me. It's being able to pause and make sure that you're in alignment with sort of that common good, that you're not compromising, what it is that you truly want in life and at the end of life. In our pursuits of things like money and jobs and, status. Is to keep in mind that benevolence, mercy, and charity are the foundations upon which we as a community rely and function on. And anything else, any facet of that common good that comes out of it depends on it. And if we do anything to sacrifice that, we will meet our maker in the end. And there will be no diamond left. There will be no benevolence. There will be no mercy. And there will be no charity in death.
Well, on that note, and thanks for those profound and deep insights there, Ryan. I'm glad we've had the opportunity to take a pause and to reflect upon the meaning of Christmas again. And I feel like my own understanding of this topic has been enriched over our conversations, and hopefully will continue to be enriched as we continue to reflect on the meaning of Christmas on the years to come. But for this present year, I think we've reflected sufficiently enough and exhausted the topic as far as we possibly could within the limits allowed. And so on that note, I just want to close the discussion and thank you listeners for tuning in. So stay tuned for more recordings going forward. We have some more original content in the works. But for the time being, I hope that this conversation has helped stimulate your own thinking on the subject and has caused you to pause and reflect on what the meaning of Christmas means to you. So on that note, I'd like to sign off for now and hope that you tune in real soon. Bye for now.